The photograph arrived in a shipping container with 300 other items from a maritime museum that had closed in Cornwall. I work as an archivist for the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and part of my job involves cataloguing acquisitions from smaller institutions that can no longer maintain their collections. Most of the items were standard fare: ship models, navigation instruments, logbooks, the usual accumulation of coastal history. But this photograph stood out immediately. It was large, perhaps 16 by 20 inches, mounted on thick board that had warped slightly with age. The image showed approximately 20 men, arranged in 3 rows in front of what appeared to be a lifeboat. The boat itself was impressive, suspended on some kind of display framework, with decorative bunting and flags draped around it. The men wore heavy sweaters and work clothes, their faces weathered and serious. At the top of the boat, partially visible, was text that appeared to read Duke, followed by more letters I couldn't quite make out. The photograph had a typed label affixed to the bottom of the mounting board. Crew of the Duke of Cornwall, Penzance Station, 1888. I'd handled thousands of maritime photographs. This appeared to be a formal crew portrait, the kind that lifeboat stations commissioned to commemorate their volunteers. The men looked strong, capable, the sort of individuals you'd want coming to your rescue in a storm. But something about the image unsettled me in a way I couldn't immediately identify. I set it aside to catalogue later and continued working through the container. 3 hours later, I came across a leather-bound ledger marked Penzance RNLI Station Records, 1885 to 1895. I brought it back to my desk, along with the photograph, thinking I might find information that would help me date and identify the crew more precisely. The ledger was meticulous. Every launch of the lifeboat was recorded. Date, time, weather conditions, nature of the emergency, outcome of the rescue. I flipped through pages documenting dozens of rescues. Fishing boats caught in squalls, merchant vessels run aground, sailors swept overboard, lives saved, bodies recovered. The brutal arithmetic of the sea. I found the entry for the Duke of Cornwall easily enough. She'd been stationed at Penzance from 1886 to 1889. A self-righting lifeboat, 35 feet long, one of the newer designs. The station master's notes described her as a fine boat, well suited to the conditions off Cornwall. Then I found an entry that made my hands go cold. December 19, 1888. Duke of Cornwall launched 11:47 p.m. in response to distress signals from the schooner Mary Catherine. Reported taking on water 5 miles southwest of Mousehole. Conditions: Force 9 gale, heavy seas, snow. Crew of 16 volunteers departed under command of coxswain Thomas Penrose. I flipped the page, expecting to find the usual notation about the rescue's outcome. Instead, I found this. December 20, 1888. Duke of Cornwall failed to return. Search launched at first light. No trace of boat or crew found. Mary Catherine discovered capsized and abandoned 3 miles from reported position. Presumed all hands lost. Schooner crew, 4, and lifeboat crew, 16. Memorial service held, December 27. 16 men. Lost at sea. The entire crew of the Duke of Cornwall. Gone in a single night. I looked at the photograph again, with new understanding. These men, These 20 or so men posing with their lifeboat had all died. The photograph had been taken in 1888, the same year the boat was lost. But something didn't add up. The ledger said the crew that launched on December 19 numbered 16. The photograph clearly showed more than 16 men. I counted carefully. 22 men total. I spent the rest of the day researching the Duke of Cornwall and the disaster of December 1888. I found newspaper accounts, memorial records, and lists of the dead. All confirmed the same story. 16 volunteers had launched in a winter gale to rescue a schooner's crew, and none had returned. The lifeboat herself had vanished completely, never found, despite extensive searches. The 16 names were recorded in multiple sources. Thomas Penrose, coxswain, age 42. James Trelawney, second coxswain, age 38. William Harvey, age 34. John Nichols, age 29. Samuel Rowe, age 41. Robert Pengelly, age 36. Joseph Stevens, age 27. Charles Tremaine, age 33. Edward Pascoe, age 45. Henry Blewett, age 31. Thomas Julian, age 28. Francis Chegwitton, age 39. Richard Rodder, age 44. Peter Michel, age 30. George Trembath, age 37. Matthew Clements, age 26. 16 men. But the photograph showed 22. I examined the image more carefully under magnification. All the men appeared sonnet, clearly photographed at the same time in the same place. This wasn't a composite image with people added later. It was a single exposure. Everyone present when the shutter opened, but 6 of the men in the photograph had no business being there, if the records were correct. I decided to see if I could identify the individuals in the photograph and match them to the list of the dead. I found other photographs in the museum's collection, showing Cornish lifeboat crews from the same period. By comparing faces, clothing, and physical characteristics, I managed to tentatively identify several men. The man in the center of the front row, distinguished by his cap and commanding posture, was almost certainly Thomas Penrose, the coxswain. To his right, James Trelawney. I worked my way through the photograph, matching faces to names, until I'd identified 14 of the 16 men who had died in December 1888, which left 8 men unaccounted for. 8 faces I couldn't match to any name on the casualty list. I expanded my research, looking for other RNLI disasters in Cornwall during the 1880s. I found several. The waters off the Cornish coast were brutal, and lifeboat crews died with heartbreaking regularity. On March 11, 1883, the lifeboat Solomon Brown from St. Ives had capsized during a rescue attempt. 5 crew members drowned. On November 3, 1886, the Lady of the Isles from Sennan Cove had been swamped by a rogue wave. 3 men lost. On April 17, 1887, the Ajax from Porthleven had disappeared during a search for a missing fishing boat. The entire crew of 8 was never found. I looked up photographs and records for these disasters, and then I found something that made my breath catch. In the museum's collection was another photograph, smaller than the Duke of Cornwall crew portrait, showing the crew of the Ajax from Porthleven, dated early 1887. The photograph was damaged, water-stained, but clear enough to make out faces. I compared it to the Duke of Cornwall photograph. 3 of the extra men in the Duke of Cornwall portrait were identical to men in the Ajax photograph. Men who had died in April 1887. More than a year before the Duke of Cornwall crew portrait was supposedly taken in 1888. Dead men, appearing in a photograph taken after their deaths. I felt dizzy. I sat back from my desk, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. The dates had to be wrong, or the identifications, or something. Photographs didn't work like that. Dead men didn't appear in images taken after they died. Unless... I thought about post-mortem photography, which had been common in the Victorian era. Families photographed their dead as a way of preserving their memory. Could this be something similar? A memorial photograph, with images of dead crewmen somehow incorporated to honor them. But that didn't explain why they were there. The Duke of Cornwall crew portrait appeared to be a standard working photograph, not a memorial. And the integration of the figures was seamless. They weren't obviously superimposed or added later. I decided to consult with Dr. Helena Marsh, a colleague who specialized in Victorian photography techniques. I sent her high-resolution scans of both photographs, along with my findings, and asked if she could explain how images of dead men might appear in a later photograph. Her response came the next morning. "This is extraordinary. I've examined the scans carefully, and I can find no evidence of photographic manipulation. The emulsion is continuous across the entire image. These aren't composite photographs, or multiple exposures. Everyone in the Duke of Cornwall image was present when the photograph was taken. If your identification is correct, and those are indeed men who died in 1887, then they were somehow physically present in 1888, when this photograph was made. Physically present. Men who had died at sea, appearing a year later for a crew photograph. I kept researching, diving deeper into the history of the Penzance lifeboat station. I found more photographs, more records, more names. And I discovered something that rewove my understanding of what I was looking at. In a box of miscellaneous papers from the Cornwall Museum, I found a letter dated January 3rd, 1889, written by a woman named Mary Penrose to her sister in Plymouth. Mary was the widow of Thomas Penrose, the coxswain of the Duke of Cornwall. The letter was difficult to read, the handwriting shaky with grief. But one passage stood out. The photograph arrived today, the one Thomas had commissioned in September. Seeing him there, with his crew, all of them so proud and strong, breaks my heart anew. But there is something strange about the image that I cannot explain. When I look at it closely, I see faces I know to be dead. Men who drowned years ago on other boats. They stand among Thomas's crew as though they were still alive. I showed it to Reverend Polkinghorne, and he said it was a sign that the sea keeps all her dead together. that the crews who go down together are never truly separated. He said Thomas is with his brothers now, and I should take comfort in that. But I find no comfort in it at all. The sea keeps all her dead together. I stared at the photograph with new eyes. This wasn't a memorial image or a composite created to honor the dead. This was something else entirely. This was a photograph showing the living crew of the Duke of Cornwall in September 1888, 3 months before they would all die. And standing among them, appearing as solid and real as the men who still drew breath, were the ghosts of lifeboatmen who had already died in previous disasters. Dead men, standing with the soon-to-be dead, all of them together in one image. All of them bound by the same fate. I found more photographs in the collection, other lifeboat crews from other stations around Cornwall. I examined each one carefully, comparing faces to casualty lists, checking dates against disaster records. The pattern repeated itself. Again and again, photographs of lifeboat crews from the 1880s and 1890s showed extra men. Men who had died years before the photographs were taken. Men who appeared solid and present, standing shoulder to shoulder with their living brothers, waiting for the sea to claim them all. It was as though death at sea created some kind of bond, some connection that transcended time, as though the men who died trying to save others joined an invisible crew that continued to serve, appearing in photographs as warnings or witnesses, or simply as reminders that the sea always collects its due. I shared my findings with Dr. Marsh and several other colleagues. The responses ranged from skeptical to disturbed. No one could explain it. Some suggested collective grief had created memorial composites that were later forgotten as such. Others proposed photographic anomalies we didn't yet understand. A few simply refused to engage with the evidence, insisting I must be mistaken. But I wasn't mistaken. I'd checked and rechecked. The men in these photographs were real. The dates were accurate. And the dead appeared among the living with inexplicable consistency. The museum director decided to include the Duke of Cornwall photograph in an upcoming exhibition on Victorian maritime rescue services, along with the information I'd uncovered. We debated how much to emphasize the anomalies, whether to present them as unexplained phenomena or simply as curious historical footnotes. In the end, we chose to let visitors draw their own conclusions. The exhibition placard read, "Asters's crew of the Duke of Cornwall, Penzance Lifeboat Station, 1888. This photograph was taken in September 1888, 3 months before the entire crew was lost in a rescue attempt on December 19th. Careful examination of the image reveals the presence of several men who appear to match photographs of lifeboatmen who died in earlier disasters, including the loss of the Ajax in 1887. The reason for their appearance in this photograph remains unexplained. The exhibition opened in March, and the Duke of Cornwall photograph became one of its most discussed pieces. Visitors stood in front of it for long minutes, studying the faces, trying to identify which men were living and which were already dead when the photograph was taken. Some people were moved to tears. Others were skeptical. Many were simply confused, struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what should have been possible. I found myself returning to the photograph repeatedly, drawn to it in a way I couldn't fully explain. I'd look at Thomas Penrose's face, strong, determined. unaware that he had only 3 months left to live. I'd look at the faces of the ghost crew, the men who'd died years before, who stood among the living as though they'd never left. And I'd think about what it meant to be a lifeboatman in the 19th century, to volunteer again and again, to go out into storms that killed professional sailors, to risk everything to save strangers, to know that every launch might be your last, and to go anyway. These men hadn't been soldiers or explorers seeking glory. They'd been fishermen, laborers, ordinary men who'd simply said yes when the call came. And when they died trying to save others. Maybe that was why they appeared in the photographs. Maybe death at sea, death in service, created a bond so strong it bent the rules of time and photography. Maybe the men who'd already died came back to stand with their brothers, to let them know they wouldn't be alone when the sea took them. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe grief and love, and the desperate human need to believe that the dead aren't really gone, created these images. Maybe the photographers, or the families, or the surviving crewmen wanted so badly to believe their lost brothers were still present, that somehow, impossibly, the photographs showed them that way. I don't know the truth. I've studied these images for months now, and I'm no closer to understanding how or why the dead appear in them. All I know is what I see. Men who died at sea, standing with men who will soon die at sea. All of them together, in photographs that shouldn't be possible. The Duke of Cornwall was never found. The boat and her entire crew of 16 vanished into a December gale, and were never seen again. But in the photograph, taken 3 months before, they remain, strong, capable, ready to serve. And standing with them, visible to anyone who knows where to look, are the ghosts of men who've already made the same journey. Men from the Ajax, lost in 1887. Men from the Solomon Brown, lost in 1883. Men from other boats, other disasters. All of them bound together by the same terrible courage. They stand together in the photograph, the living and the dead, the soon-to-be lost and the long gone. And if you look very carefully, if you study their faces, you might notice something else. They're not looking at the camera. Almost none of them are looking at the camera. They're looking at the sea. At the force that would take them all, eventually. The force they'd dedicated their lives to challenging, knowing they would lose in the end. The photograph hangs in the National Maritime Museum now, behind protective glass. The exhibition has ended, but we kept the Duke of Cornwall portrait on permanent display. It's become one of the museum's most visited pieces. People still stop to stare at it, still try to identify which faces belong to the living and which to the dead. Still wonder how a photograph could capture something impossible. I pass it several times a week on my way to the archives, and each time I stop for a moment to look at those faces, to honor those men. To remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's saying yes when the lifeboat launches, even knowing you might not return. 22 men in the photograph. 16 who would die in December 1888. 6 who had already died in the years before. All of them lifeboatmen, all of them volunteers. all of them standing together, bound by service and sacrifice, and the terrible egalitarian democracy of the sea. The Duke of Cornwall never returned from her final launch. But in this photograph, taken in September 1888, she remains forever ready. Her crew stands at attention, living and dead, together, waiting for the call that will never come again. The boat that never returned. The crew that never came home. Except in this image, where they remain, forever, ready, strong, together. The living and the dead, the saved and the lost. All of them, in the end, brothers. All of them, forever. Crew.